Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Bas and in this video I'm going to go over several options you have when you want to knit ribbing on a single bed knitting machine. I'm going to show you on this knitting machine. This is my Singer Solo knitting machine. It is a flat bed knitting machine, so it lies flat on the table. It is a single bed knitting machine, so it has one needle bed. And there lies the challenge, because when you want to knit ribbing, you need to be able to knit stitches and purl stitches, which are basically the opposite of each other. And to do so, you need two needle beds opposite of each other. So you can either knit a true rib on a true double bed knitting machine, or you can knit a true rib on a flat bed knitting machine with an additional ribber bed. But you need two beds. So what are your options if you want to knit ribbing on a single flatbed knitting machine? Option number 1, you can knit a mock rib. And a mock rib basically is a mock rib. It's a fake rib. It looks like rib, but it isn't really rib. You knit it on every other needle in a smaller stitch size and then you fold it double like a folded hem. Let me show you how it's done. I'm going to knit my project with this yarn. This is a cheap acrylic yarn, and for thickness reference it is a ball of 100 gram and it has 241 meters. And I have already wound another ball into a cake, which I'm going to use for the knitting on this machine. I have also got another ball. This is thinner yarn. This is waste yarn left over from another project, and I'm going to do the cast on in this waste yarn. And for this example, I'm going to select 10 needles to the left, 10 needles to the right, which makes a total of 20 needles. And I'm placing these needles in knitting position 2. I'm making sure that all the latches are open, and if they're not open, I'm opening them now. So I'm going to make a small sample for this video. I'm going to add my metal bar into the cast-on comb, hang it onto the needles, click it into the groove on the knitting machine. I set the needle selector switch to 1, so I press it, and I set my stitch size to 3. I place my yarn on the floor, hooking the yarn end in the yarn stopper on the right side of the machine. I lay in the yarn in the needle hooks. I slightly tension the yarn with my left hand, and I take my carriage across. Now all my needles have switched to knitting position 1, so my cast-on comb is free, so I can release the cast-on comb and let it hang freely. Now I'm going to slide the carriage from left to right, still in knitting position 1. So nothing happened. I'm going to depress the needle selector switch to needle position 2, and I take my carriage across from right to left. Okay, so all my needles are back out in working position. My yarn is on the left hand side, my carriage is on the left side, so now I can start knitting a few rows in waste yarn. For the final pass of the carriage, I'm going to increase the stitch size to the size I'm going to use for my main yarn, in this case 6. I lay in my final row of waste yarn, carriage across, finished. Waste yarn part is done. I'm going to release the yarn from the yarn stopper on the right side of the machine. I'm going to place my main yarn on the floor. I'm going to anchor my main yarn on the right side of the machine. I'm going to hang some edge weights. I'm going to lay in my main yarn in the needle hooks, checking that all the latches are open. I'm going to take my carriage from right to left. So this is the first row knitted. And now I want to half out my stitches, so I want to transfer every other stitch to the adjacent stitch. And to make it easier for myself, I'm going to bring all my needles back to knitting position 1. So on the carriage, I press the needle selector switch to knitting position 1. I lay in my yarn and I take my carriage across from left to right. So now all my needles are back into knitting position 1. I take my transfer tool, in this case the 1-prong transfer tool, and I'm going to leave the rightmost needle where it is. I'm going to pick up the second needle from the right and transfer it to the needle on the left. Pick up the next needle, transfer it onto the next needle, and so on. And for the final needle, I'm going to transfer this needle 1 to the left. So now all my needles have 1 needle spacing in between out of work. So I'm checking that these needles are out of work. And now I want to continue knitting, so I want to bring out all my needles that are now in needle position number 1 into needle position number 2. So I want to bring them forward so I can lay in the yarn. Because my yarn is on the right side and my carriage is on the right side, I want to start knitting from this position. So to bring out my needles in needle position 2, first I'm going to leave my carriage in needle position 1, take my carriage across from right to left, so nothing happens. And now I'm going to press my carriage into needle position 2, take my carriage across again. Now all my needles are brought forward into needle position 2, so I can start knitting. I'm going to set my row counter on 0, and this mock rib will be folded in half, so we're going to have to knit twice as many rows as you want the length of your rib to be. Furthermore, I'm going to knit my rib 2 tensions. You can even go 3 tensions, but I'm going 2 tensions smaller, so tighter, than you want to knit your actual garment with. So I want to knit my garment in stitch size 6, which is already set for the first 2 passes. And now for the mock rib, I'm going to go down 2 numbers to 4. I'm going to lay in the yarn in the needle hooks. All the latches are open. And I want a rib of 10 rows. So for this mock rib, I'm going to knit 20 rows. Every so many rows I'm going to move up my edge weights. And for the final pass of the carriage, I want my needles to go back to knitting position 1 to make transferring stitches in the next step easier. So I'm going to press my needle selector switch to position 1. I lay in my yarn and I take my carriage across. Now the needles are back into knitting position 1. Now I'm going to add all the needles I put out of work previously back into work. So now all needles are back into work. I'm going to remove my edge weights. I'm going to take my transfer tool. Now I have needle number 10 to needle number 11. So I started out with 20 needles. So I'm going to place this stitch back onto the needle number 10. So now I'm back to 20 needles. And now I'm going to look at my knitting. We have the pink waste yarn cast on, and then in light bluish yarn we have here our first row of stitches. This is the first row, and these stitches must be hung onto all these needles. So we're going to look for the first stitch on the right, and it's this stitch. So I'm going to pick up this stitch and I'm going to hang it on the rightmost needle. Now on the left side, the most left stitch is this stitch. And I'm going to hang it on the leftmost needle. Now all the other 18 stitches must be hung on these 18 needles. In exactly the same way, pick up the stitch, transfer it to the needle. Pick up the stitch, transfer it to the needle, etc. Okay, all stitches are hanging on the needles. So you must have exactly the same amount of stitches on your first row as you have needles on your knitting. If you are missing a needle, this is the time to investigate and figure out where you're missing a stitch. Otherwise it will unravel after you take your work from the machine. Now I need to bring out all my needles forward again to be able to continue knitting. My yarn is on the right side and my carriage is also on the right side. So I'm going to take my carriage across with the needle selector switch in position 1, so nothing happens. Like this. And now I take my carriage across in needle position 2, so the needles come forward. So all my stitches are behind the latches, all my latches are open, and I can continue knitting. I leave my carriage on needle selector switch number 2 and I set my stitch size to the stitch size for my main yarn, which is 6. I rehang my edge weights, I lay in my yarn, tension it slightly and I take my carriage across. So now my mock rib hem is finished. I'm going to reset my row counter and I can knit as many rows for my garment in just plain jersey stockinette stitch as I want. So for this example I'm going to knit about 20 rows. And now I'm going to quickly bind off to take my work from the machine to show you what I have knitted. And here we have our knitting. So I'm going to take the straw from the cast-on comb, release the knitting from the cast-on comb. So this is the back, remove the waste yarn, turn my knitting around, and here you see the mock rib. So it does look like rib, but it's not as stretchy as actual rib. And it's folded, so it's a double fabric. And then I've knitted some stocking stitch. So in a garment, this looks great. Now on to option number 2, hand manipulated rib. Hand manipulated rib is actual real ribbing. But instead of knitting the knit and purl stitches directly on the knitting machine, you just knit plain on the knitting machine, and with a latch hook tool you form the ribbing by hand. That's why it's called hand manipulated ribbing. And the start is the same as always. I'm going to cast on with waste yarn, so I'm going to skip over it pretty quickly, and I'll see you when I switch to the main yarn. Okay, so I am all set up. I knitted some waste yarn, I hung my edge weights, and now I can start knitting with my main yarn. And I'm going to E-wrap all the needles, so I'm going to do a closed cast on. I'm going to slightly push my needles forward and push the knitting back. So I have created some space because I'm going to E-wrap behind the latches. I'm going to anchor my main yarn in the yarn stopper on the left side of the machine. I'm coming up on the right side of a needle, down on the left. Up on the right, down on the left. And keep it rather loose. Now I'm going to push the needles back into knitting position 2 again. So both the waste yarn and the E-wrap is behind the latch. I'm going to knit my cast on edge in the stitch size I'm going to use for my main yarn, in this case 6, and the needle selector switch is set to 2. I'm going to lay in my yarn in the needle hooks, slightly tension it on the left side and take my carriage across from right to left. Cast on is done. I'm going to reset my row counter. And for this hand manipulated rib, I'm going to tighten the stitch size with 3 whole numbers, so from 6 to 3. And now I'm going to knit 9 more rows for my ribbing, so I get a total of 10 rows. For the final row, I want my needles to end up in knitting position 1. So it makes it latching up easier. So I'm going to press the needle selector switch to 1. And I'm also going to increase my stitch size back to 6. So the final row of ribbing will have the stitch size that I want for my normal knitting. Lay in the yarn, carriage across. Okay, so here we have our knitting. We have in pink the casting on and waste yarn. Then we have an E-wrap cast on in the main yarn. Then we knit it up until 10 rows. So now I'm going to take my latch hook tool and I'm going to latch up every other needle for a 1x1 rib. You can also latch up every 2 needles, 2x2 or 2x1. It's what you prefer, but for this example I'm going to do a 1x1 rib. I'm going to start on the left side and I'm going to look closely at my knitting. I want to drop my second needle. This is the column of my second needle. I'm going to insert my latch hook tool in the stitch above the pink waste yarn. So this hole. I'm going to drop the stitch. I'm going to unravel this entire column. So the entire column is now unraveled. I have 1 stitch on my latch hook tool. I slide it behind the latch and I pick the next bar, like so. And now I pull that bar through the stitch. And I continue for the next bar. Every time letting the current stitch on the latch hook tool slide behind the latch and grabbing the next bar in the hook and pulling it through. And you continue like this all the way up. So you're basically reforming the stitches by hand. And then you hang it onto the needle. So 1 column of stitches is reformed. Then I'm going to skip 1 and reform the next column of stitches. And now you can already see it more easily. So I'm going to insert my hook in this hole just above the pink waste yarn. I'm going to drop that column of stitches. And now I'm going to latch hook up all the stitches. Every time letting the current stitch on the latch hook tool slide behind the latch and grabbing the next bar in the hook and pulling it through. At first this will go rather slow, but once you get the hang of it, you get into a sort of a rhythm. And it actually goes quite fast. Skip 1, drop 1. Okay, now I have latched up all columns except the final needle. I'm just going to leave it as is. I'm going to rehang my edge weights. Okay, so now I want to continue knitting with my normal knitting. So I have to bring out my needles, passing the carriage in needle selector position 1, needle position 2. Now my carriage is on the right side and my yarn end is on the right side. I'm going to reset the row counter. I'm going to lay in my yarn and now I'm going to knit 20 rows. Bind off, take my work from the machine. And here is my knitting. I'm going to remove the straw from the cast-on comb, release my knitting, remove the waste yarn. So this is the back side and this is the front. And this is actual ribbing, a 1x1 hand manipulated rib. Okay, on to option number 3. And this is an option often overlooked and sometimes not even taken seriously, but it is to just knit your ribbing by hand with ordinary knitting needles. Start knitting your ribbing with ordinary knitting needles and then hang your work on the machine and continue knitting on your knitting machine. And I get it. I mean, you've got a knitting machine, you want to knit everything on your knitting machine. It can even feel a bit like cheating, but hand knitting your ribbing is a perfectly viable option. Make sure you swatch your knitting on the knitting machine and your hand knitting so you can choose your stitch size and knitting needles accordingly. So let's do some hand knitting. Okay, hand knitting is done. So now I'm going to hang my hand knitting onto the machine and I have hand knitted 20 stitches of ribbing. So I'm going to select 20 stitches. 10 needles to the left side of 0, 10 needles to the right side of 0. I'm going to place them in knitting position 2, checking that all the latches are open. Okay, so now hang my hand knitting onto the machine needles. My carriage is on the right side, so I want my yarn end to be on the right side as well, so I can continue knitting when I'm done hanging the stitches on the knitting machine. Okay, so I slide my stitches to the end of my knitting needle, and then I pick up the first needle, slide it off the knitting needle and onto the machine needle. Second stitch, off the knitting needle, onto the machine needle. Third stitch. And you do this for all the stitches. So now my knitting is on the knitting machine. I push my knitting back. So the knitting is behind the needle latches. I hang some weights to weigh the knitting down. I slide my needles back into knitting position 2. My hand knitted rib is on the machine. my yarn end is on the right hand side, my carriage is on the right side, I have some weights on my knitting, so now I can continue knitting for as many rows as I want my normal knitting to be, and in this case I'm going to knit 20 rows. Final pass, 20 rows, time to cast off. And here is the knitting. My hand knitted rib on ordinary knitting needles, really stretchy. Then I hung it onto the machine, I added some weights and I continued in just normal plain knitting. So our three options. We have the mock rib, so it's like the double folded fake rib, the mock rib. It looks great, a great ribbing. Then we have our hand manipulated rib, also a great rib, this is real rib. And then we have our hand knitted rib. We knitted it on the knitting needles and then hung it onto the machine and continued on the knitting machine. Option 1, option 2, option 3. So I have shown you 3 ways of knitting ribbing or ribbing look-alike fabric when knitting with a single bed knitting machine. The mock rib, the hand manipulated rib and the hand knitted rib. All 3 perfectly great options. So choose the one that you like best for your next project. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below. It all helps out the channel a lot. Thanks. I wish you happy knitting and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!